it's perhaps harder to recognize violence in the forms it most often and most dangerously takes, in the vast, surrounding, all-encompassing forms of violence that stretch across lifetimes, geographies, and generations. Once you scratch the surface, violence moves beyond a mere descriptor into a function of power, a strategy, a series of continued actions mobilized by institutions of all kinds, schools, healthcare systems, states and colonial states, and multinational corporations, to name a few. These grand, slow violences are often so difficult to recognize because they exceed the language we have available to describe them. They are shrouded in silence, in words unspoken. They can be buried in so many ways. So a discussion of violence prompts a series of necessary questions. How do you speak about something which language cannot articulate? How can we talk about painful and continuing forms of violence in ways that center and attend to those experiencing them? What place does violence have in social movements, which will always be deemed violent regardless of their actions? What, if anything, can we do with this knowledge? And for example, what does it mean to truly heed the words of activist Kimberly Jones, who, when speaking at a protest in the US last summer, said that they are lucky that what Black people are looking for is equality and not revenge? What do we do with these words? I want to make clear that this space should be as easy to be in as possible. And if difficult things arise, I want you to feel able to react as you wish. If you want cameras on or off, if you need to leave, if you want to lie down, please do whatever makes you comfortable. And if there are any issues, send me a private message in the chat and I'll see what I can do. So the two speakers we have here today are in the best possible position to help us untangle these messy knots of understanding. And I can't wait to hear what they have to say. So I'd like to welcome Akanksha Mehta, who is a lecturer in gender, sexuality and cultural studies and the co-director of the Center for Feminist Research at Goldsmiths, alongside Ruba Salih, professor of anthropology and sociology and chair of the Center for Migration and Diaspora Studies at SOAS University. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here.
Thank you so much, Rory, and thank you so much, Amy. Thank you firstly for having us here in this space and creating this really wonderful, intimate space to have this conversation, and also just like how you've just organized it, talked about what the context is, what the overall project is, and also just what the rules and guidelines framing this discussion is. Like, this is a really accessible and wonderful feminist space that you've created, and like, I'm really, really grateful to be part of this. I'm also really grateful to be here with Ruba. When I was a PhD student at SOAS, at Center for Gender Studies, Ruba was a reader and senior lecturer, I think, and reader at the same place. And it's been like quite wonderful to, you know, share this space after so many years of like knowing each other. So yeah, so thank you for having us and for everyone who's here to be part of this conversation. So, sorry, can you just give me a minute? Okay. So someone was at the door. What we're going to do is just have a conversation about some of the things that we've been thinking about on the topic of violence. I think the way that Rory really framed the session was quite expansive and brings up a lot of the issues that like we've been grappling with as those who've been thinking, writing, reading on violence. So I'm just going to like start with these two quotes that some of you in the audience who I can recognize as being students at Goldsmiths have probably heard me say this before, but there are these two quotes by Veena Das that I find quite useful when we think about violence. And the first one says, how is it that we can find references to courage, sacrifice, heroism, cowardice, despair, grief, angst, anger, suffocation, laughter, parody, longing, love, hate, disgust, horror, fear, pain, suffering. In fact, every conceivable kind of emotion or disposition as part of the experience of violence. And the second one says, violence is something that has the potential to both disrupt the ordinary and become part of the ordinary. And I think that these words, you know, they're from 2008 and from Veena Das's work back then, but we can still think of them in so many ways right now, because as Rory pointed out, what is violence and how do we even conceptualize violence? Something that seems so ubiquitous, I'd like to think it's the right word that I used, but also something that is often mediated to us as something spectacular, something out there, something, you know, that we can get desensitized to. At the same time, it's structuring lives of so many, of Black and brown, working class, queer, disabled, trans people around the world who are being affected by state violence, by settler colonial violence, by the violence of racial capitalism. So just to sort of frame this, and I'm going to hand over to Ruba in a bit and then come back and we'll just have a back and forth. I think like more than like us trying to define what violence is, which is what often happens in many academic discussions or thinking about violence, what is the more interesting question is what is signified as violence and when, why, and how. At what point is something articulated as violence and in what ways and by whom? So this brings us to the discussions on how protests and uprisings often get framed. And I'm thinking here recently after the murder of Sarah Everard in the UK, in London, when there were calls for having, you know, a response, a space to grieve, as well as a space to express anger and rage at the ways in which state and police had enabled this kind of gender-based sexual violence that has become quite, you know, that is tied into the fabric of like everyday life in this country and in the world globally. And a lot happened in the aftermath of that murder. Firstly, the revelation that it was the police that was a police officer opened up conversations on abolition in a very different way. Because as Lola Olufemi has pointed out, abolition often, you know, runs into this conversation where the question of sexual violence or gender-based violence comes up. And there seems to be almost an intuitive, impulsive, like sort of move to go into carceral ideas of justice. And that the murder of Sarah Everard opened up a very public conversation and connecting it to Kill the Bill and the protest that Sisters Uncut led, to start thinking about how abolition was really something quite concrete that we needed to bring into every conversation on gender-based and sexual violence. It also opened up conversations on what violence counts and what violence actually matters, what violence is given attention, because as many have pointed out, you know, other women and non-binary people of color have been murdered through gender-based and sexual violence regimes of the state and the ways in which it is experienced in the everyday, but similar kinds of attention have never been paid. But the conversation that was very interesting to me and really important to me was this conversation around the aftermath, when people gathered to protest and to show anger, rage, and also grief together. It became a sort of framing between peaceful vigil and violent protest, where when the police in Clapham Common attacked protesters, arrested protesters, and unleashed various forms of state violence against protesters, the conversation on one hand became, well, there were mostly women who were just laying down flowers and grieving, and the police attacked, you know, a sort of subject that was seen as non-violent because it was mainly those signified as women, many white women who were using flowers that are usually symbolized as, you know, some kind of peaceful gesture. And this kind of framing between this was just a vigil, people just wanted to grieve. Whereas, you know, if had it been a so-called violent protest, then police violence would have been more acceptable. And this is where the problem lies, that we tend to kind of resort to this binary of what is violence and what is peace quite easily. There were a lot of critiques of this kind of sentiment that particularly focused on Black Lives Matter uprisings, saying that when Black Lives Matter uprisings are going on in the streets, are they also not spaces of grieving and mourning? You know, and who is allowed to grieve and mourn and in what ways? Can we only grieve and mourn in these sort of so-called peaceful ways? And what bodies are actually allowed to grieve and mourn? So here are some really interesting conversations and things, not just conversations that we have in, you know, academic terms, but conversations that are directly related to our political organizing against state violence and against carceral violence that we need to think about. What gets signified as violence? What gets signified as peace? When do we run from violence to peace? And when do we start having this urge to justify, no, this was actually peaceful, hence state violence is not acceptable? You know, what about the lives of like queer, disabled, Black, brown, trans people of color who are facing, as Rory put it, slow violence in such a continual way? Why is it that then we don't resort to this idea of non-violence and peace, but that violence just goes through structures that no one contests? So I'm going to pass to Ruba and then come back, and then we'll just see how the conversation goes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, for inviting me. I was very excited to be in this kind of setting, to discover that something that like this experience exists in Newington. And it's a bit of a pain to be online, and I would have wanted to really be there and feel the vibe of the place and to know the history of the, I got very curious about the legacy of this place, and I was very enthusiastic, and I'm very grateful for this invitation. And likewise, I was really excited to see and hear that Akanshka was going to be around the same event. So thank you very much for this opportunity. So actually, Akanshka has started her reflections by quoting Benadas and Rory and Amy as well. I think have touched upon some of the issues that I've been kind of thinking about over the years around my research, which focuses on, particularly in the last few years, on Palestinian refugees and political agency. And obviously, when we talk about Palestinian refugees, we cannot but think about long histories of displacement, of violence, ongoing dispossession. So a violence that hasn't had a starting moment and an ending, but that is ongoing. And in Arabic, we call the Nakba, the catastrophe that happened in 1948, the ongoing Nakba, the ongoing catastrophe. So let me start my my brief set of reflections, or my initial set of reflections around the recent events. So the bombing of Gaza, the ethnic cleansing that we have come to be used to see happening in East Jerusalem, or in some of the neighborhoods of occupied East Jerusalem, like Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and other places. And the reflection I would like to share about the violence that we have been seeing unfolding in the last month or two, particularly around these places in which the Israeli army killed at least 287 Palestinians, out of which 70 were children. To me, one aspect that was really striking is not only, of course, the ongoingness, and we know that every 6-7 years, Gaza goes through a carpet raising and the pain of witnessing the regularity, the cyclical nature of this violence that seems to have no end, is obviously the most overwhelming aspect. But there was one other, perhaps minor aspect that to me was also striking, and I think it needs to be mentioned here, which is the way in which, as we were all kind of glued onto social media or to the places and spaces where Palestinians had the possibility of showcasing what they were going through, it was clear that there was a constant attempt to film, to bring cameras intruding into the most painful moments of grief, the most intimate moments of burials and pain that ensued this catastrophe, this new catastrophe. And obviously the reason of this is that the erasure of the Palestinian voices and the dehumanizing, the constant dehumanizing of Palestinians has been tried to kind of be resisted with this ubiquitous presence of media, of pictures, of signs that could, in a desperate attempt to kind of showcase the violence, the fact that Palestinians are the victims in this situation of settler colonialism, and the kind of violence and pain that they endure and are subject to for now 70 years. However, I couldn't help but thinking that this constant desperate need to showcase, to bring the images, to bring the cameras in the most intimate, desperate moments of loss and grief was also an effect of violence, and an indirect effect of violence, and also had its own dehumanizing effect. So this desperate attempt to make one's pain and grief visible, the denial of privacy in these tragic moments so that the world can see, I consider another, as I said, another effect of settler colonial violence, which also, and this will bring me to my second kind of set of reflections, I don't know, maybe I'll talk about them later, but which also really brings into forcefully into onto the table or into the conversation the very subtle need the very subtle contradictory work of violence, where people are subject to the painful need to remember, but also they should be allowed the dignified right to forget or to privacy when it comes to these very difficult moments of their lives. So, so this for me was really something I wanted to bring to this audience as one of the issues that I've been grappling with. We as Palestinians have been used to, we are trained to counteract our erasure by having to showcase, to bring to the fore our pain as the only kind of possibility we have. But at the same time, I consider this another effect of settler colonial violence and of our own dehumanizing. And also I wanted to say that in Palestine, the most forceful tool we had to resist this erasure has been for a long time oral history. Our archives have been destroyed. Our society wasn't one that was organized around deeds and titles and written sources. And so oral history has been our tool of resistance, of countering the erasure. And yet this oral history has often been very much imbued by nationalist frames, which has meant that certain memories are given more visibility over others, or that we have been also forced, going back to the issue I raised before, to remember, and to remember in a way that is meaningful to our audience through facts, through facts that can be verified, through images, through the grounds set by our oppressor. And yet what I would like to talk about here is actually, as I mentioned, the kind of subtle contradictory work between remembering and forgetting, or if you wish, the wider relationship between violence and memory, and the place of vulnerability in these memories, and what kind of place can vulnerability have also as a radical political way of rethinking agency, if you wish. But maybe I can talk about this in a moment, in a kind of, after maybe Akanshka has also been able to respond to this or to connect to this.
Thank you for that, Ruba. I'm really looking forward to listening more and to actually reading this piece. I know you said that it's unpublished, this writing, but yeah, it would be like really great to have it out there.
Yeah, I mean, I can continue, but...
Yeah, do you want to continue and then I can come in after that?
Yeah, yeah, sure, yeah. So as I mentioned, I'm very interested in these issues, and Akanshka has brought to the fore the very powerful words of Vena Das, an anthropologist who has produced some of the most powerful feminist work, I think, on what come to be seen as perhaps the non-nationalist, the most marginal ways of thinking about violence, and particularly when it comes to the relationship between violence, vulnerability, and memory, and trauma. So the question really I'm kind of grappling with in my research, and which I would like to share with you today, is around, again, what does this remembering and narrating and visualizing as a form of agency does to the subjects of violence, and how and whether the impetus to remember and narrate can be reconciled with the need, as I said, to forget, when the pain and the suffering are too deep and too traumatic to be able to be remembered and narrated, and when our interlocutors want and ask us to forget. So where does it leave us with the fact that we are almost impeded from this very human act of forgetting when our history is a traumatic history? And to that aim, I would like to go back to the point I was making before, that for too long, I think we have been used to think that agency lies in in a type of resistance that is very much tied to taking to the publics through sort of like, if you remember the first and second intifadas, through sort of a very visible and embodied form of reaction, whether through stones or through taking away, even earlier than the first intifada, the young men from the Israeli soldiers. That was the role of the mothers, to the boycott, to all kinds of actions and forms of agencies that happen and take place in the public sphere are what account to resistance to this violence, and are what are mainly recognized as forms of resistance. And yet I'm actually interested in fracturing this way of thinking about resistance and to bring to light what can potentially be the powerful work of vulnerability, the powerful work of the private, the ordinary, the seemingly insignificant aspects that are remembered against the aspect that should be remembered but can't be remembered because the trauma is too powerful. And if we are able to read through these kind of narratives that are counter narratives, in my view, we might be able also to see counter histories to the nationalist history. So in what follows, I think I would really like to actually bring a story to you, which I think most clearly offers palpable kind of material to reflect on the issues I'm trying to unfold here. And through this history, I hope to kind of, again, underline the powerful nature of silences, of histories that are invisible, of inconsistencies, of the details that are not accounted for because they are not heroic according to the national account of history. So basically, I want to linger over the potentialities of traumatic fragmented memories as opposed to fact-based accounts and narrations. So let me tell you a story of a woman that I would call Sopria. Obviously, this is not her near name. This is a testimony I want to bring to the fore. I collected it during fieldwork. And she tells the story of her attempt to escape from 1948, the carnage that was taking place around the village that she had sought refuge into after escaping her original village. So she starts her reflection by telling us about Safsaf, which is the village that she had escaped to, which was a village that is 7 kilometers northwest of Safad, where Sopria had found refuge in 1948. However, this village had been attacked in the early mornings of 1948, of a Friday morning in October, by the Jewish paramilitary organizations, the Haganah, the Stern, and the Irgun, which were paramilitary units that were responsible for attacking villagers and making sure that people would escape either out of fear or would kind of be directly attacked and killed in the attacks. So the village was encircled from all sides, and that night, the story actually of Safsaf is very well known in Palestinian oral history, because it's one of those villages where between 50 and 70 men were shot and buried in a ditch, and several women were raped and killed on that occasion. But Sopria survived this massacre. And sometime earlier, she had escaped her hometown along with many others, seeking safety from the fury of war, as the forces were attacking the surrounding villages one after another. And today we know that most of these villagers left, as I mentioned, out of grief, fear. In fact, one terror tactic wielded by the military organizations was to broadcast ghastly sounds of sirens, of fire, of moans, of shrieks and wailing women, forewarnings what could have happened should Palestinians decide to stay put. So the story of Sopria is that she remained in Safsaf because Safsaf seemed quite safe to her. And her family was generously actually welcomed by the villagers of this little village for the time that they thought this would provide them a little bit of security. And most people thought that they would go back to their original villages. Yet the armies would soon reach Safsaf. And amidst this chaos and the terror, Sopria attempts to run from this imminent attack. But the Arab Salvation Army is patrolling the area and sending villagers back. Sopria's sister-in-law, Nazha, is returning from the fields, unaware Safsaf has been attacked. She will lose her leg on a landmine planted around the village. Sopria's memory is fixed on this moment. She's carrying Nazha on her shoulders. She needs to get her away from the shelling and shooting quite fast, but Sopria is young and she's barely more than a child. She cannot bear the weight of her sister-in-law's wounded body. So in this fraught moment, Nazha begs Sopria to leave her behind and save the children who are trapped in the house with no defense. Sopria is thus confronted with a dramatic choice. Should she remain with Nazha or run to the children's rescue? Sopria then ends her account remembering leaving her sister-in-law languishing, injured on the ground alone, and running to the children. She turns back, she remembers turning back to see the paramilitary forces stabbing Nazha in cold blood before the eyes of her mother, who dies of sorrow on the spot. So the question I'm trying to grapple with along Dana Das in her work on India is how can a survivor apprehend and remember the scale of this kind of violence, the scale of this loss and the erasure that follows. And as I said, Palestinians have had to confront extreme hostility also when trying to bring to life the gruesome details. They have been constantly denied the possibility to express these horrors, and they have been contested on the grounds of veridicity, of facticity. And so it is obvious that oral history has turned onto this need, this desperate need to show, to bring to the fore, to bring facts, to show the pain, to bear witness. And yet I'm really inspired here by Primo Levi in his book, The Drowned and the Saved, who reminds us that any reliving and retelling of traumatic memories is susceptible to fraud. But whereas the perpetrators' unconscious desire for exculpation provides an incentive to deceive, victims must be absolved for what can be a blurred rendition of events, as victims' recollection obviously can go adrift. I'm also helped here in my attempts to make sense of how to recognize the powerful nature of blurred memories, of memories that are not attached to facts, but to feelings, and to snapshots, to flashbacks, and how to give them validity. Recollecting trauma paradoxically elicits absolutely accurate and precise images that are largely accessible to conscious recall and control. To become a narrative memory, a conscious and active form of recalling that feed the canons of historical validity, trauma must be verbalized and integrated into a larger canvas, into a larger existing discourse around historical events. However, there is also the problem of the impossibility to remember other than in this form, other than in this scattered flashback way, when the trauma is actually not only still unprocessed, but is still ongoing. And this is very important. This point that is really crucial here, the problem that we know from psychotherapy that in order to be able to remember a trauma, we need to have had, or to process it, the trauma must have been ended. The conditions that brought to the trauma must have been closed. But in the Palestinian context, this, as I argued at the beginning, the trauma is ongoing. The catastrophe is an ongoing project, so that this prevents people from, and people like Sopria, from processing and healing from the trauma that has been caused by this violence. And yet, what I think is really important here as well is the ways in which paying attention to these traumatic memories in their own terms can allow or can give us a possibility to rescue some counter histories or counter memories of resistance that are not to be located in these kind of public forms of agency. For example, Sopria brings to light a hidden history of female courage, of physical resilience, of creativity, when she tells me, for example, her story of how she made sure that her thirsty child was able to drink water. For example, when her husband makes for the border, when the fighting breaks out, leaving her stranded with the two small daughters, she pays some Druze man to escort her to the Lebanese border on the backs of a donkey and a camel, with the few belongings she could salvage from the village. She also astutely hides her valuables, 2 gold swing bracelets, in her baby's pillow, and later bargains with some Jewish soldiers these bracelets as they demand her gold in exchange for allowing her to cross the border and securing water for her crying, thirsty infant. And it's again her own resourcefulness that prompts her to plunge her hijab into the bottom of a well and squeeze some water onto her hands when she cannot find any. And yet, again, these are a series of flashbacks that are difficult to bring back to a collective rendition filled with dates and facts and places. Another element here that I think is really interesting and important to underline in accounting for this issue of memory and violence is the way in which it's often the body that remembers and that keeps a score. Sopria's ways of bringing certain images into words demonstrates that her body has been able to keep memory of what has gone on and has kept a score of what she cannot process at a psychic level. So from her memory, we grasp the heaviness of the body that Sopria had to carry, the food that was eaten, the thirst and the loud cries of the children. So, and I'm sort of about to conclude. In light of Primo Levi's insights that trauma can only be apprehended once a framework exists that can give meaning to these experiences, or to use, as he does, the metaphor of the illness once recovery is completed, it is clear that the atrocities that these women have experienced have yet to be fully processed. Indeed, these kind of accounts testify to injuries that are ongoing in their present lives, or wounds which still await recognition and reparation. And the existing historical canvas, which is imbued with nationalist meanings, is what they are offered to inscribe and process the meaning of what they went through. But this canvas is both inadequate and unfinished. As I said, the ongoing actuality of the Palestinian tragedy entails not only the impossibility of curing the trauma by narrating or by forgetting, but also the effacement of some of these subjective traumatic experiences, which are often very gendered, which are subsumed or erased under the more imperative narratives of collective heroism and resistance. However, in these unprocessed traumatic memories, and I'm really concluding here, we find, I think, seeds of what could be seen as counter-narratives. Sopria, for example, resists making her trauma legible through the trope of martyrdom. In a reversal of the nationalist convention that renders the nationalist trauma the loss of the country as the paradigm according to which individual histories acquire or lose meaning and to which they can never compare. Sopria asserts that nothing can compare to or compensate for the excruciating pain of a mother who has violently lost her child. In her own poetic and political lyrics, and this is my concluding sentence, and I quote, "If I told you that my country could compare to my children, I would be lying. A child is more precious than one's own soul. A mother is more important than her child. As they say, I'd rather wish for death to have me and to spare my child. As for my country," she says, "I could never forget it, and it remains in my thoughts. But not as much as my children. Even my husband, who was martyred, not as much as my children. Not even my sister, not as much as my children. Nor my brother, not as much as my children. My older brother who died, not as much as my children. And my sister died, and they all died, but none of them compared to my children. My children were born from my heart." So I leave you with this quote from Sopria, and thank you for listening. And Akanshka, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruba. I think we can take like half a minute at least to just let what you said sink in. That was really powerful and moving and opens up so many questions on violence and memory. So I'm just going to take like a few seconds and give everyone a few seconds. So I'm thinking here also like, so some of my research is very diametrically different from Ruba's narratives because it is with those who perpetuate violence, and it is research that looks at the narratives of those who are perpetuating settler colonial, nationalist, right-wing, fascist regimes, and to make sense of the violence of women in these movements. But I'm looking particularly at women because often nationalist, right-wing, settler colonial movements have a lot of male leadership that takes up a lot of room, and we understand, you know, what is going on through those narratives. But there is a whole set of women who are working in these movements behind the scenes and actually like contributing to the perpetuation of everyday violence. And I'm thinking here of so many things that Ruba has pointed out and the ways in which they get manipulated and they get used by those who perpetuate violence. So trauma gets invoked in all sorts of settler colonial right-wing fascist narratives. And the two movements that my research looks at, the Hindu nationalist movement in India and Zionist settler project in Palestine, in both those cases, oral history and trauma gets appropriated in a completely different way, where there is a manufacturing and appropriation of narratives that are aiming to justify violence. And this takes on a very gendered, racialized, sexed, framework, because a lot of like womanhood and sexuality and nationhood and all of these things are invoked to continuously perpetuate these narratives. And I'm just thinking like, this is really spontaneously just thinking about, based on what you've said, the ways in which this work happens is so careful and constructed. It's also, it's like we talk a lot about settler colonial and nationalist violence in terms of the dispossession, in terms of the land grab, in terms of resource grab, in terms of, the bombs that fall and the violence of checkpoints, walls, or in India, the violence of policies and the violence of everything that's been going on. But one of the things that we need to pay more attention to is the knowledge production behind the scenes, because it's not arbitrary, like the projects are based on producing certain narratives and certain knowledges. And my research shows a lot on how women contribute to most of these narratives behind the scenes. So entire pedagogical projects are constructed to, do the work of perpetuating everyday violence. So for example, in the context of Israel, the women that I interviewed who belong to an organization called Women in Green, or Women for Israel's Tomorrow, who are settlers in what is called the West Bank, occupied Palestine, but also many of them are in 48 Palestine as well, living in, other cities in colonized Palestine. A lot of them work almost full time on coming up with pedagogical projects, what they call pedagogical projects, to educate people through their narratives. And these are very specific, very tailored to who the audience is. Another theme that continuously comes up is how there is a construction by perpetrators of violence of their own goodness, which again relates to the ways in which they justify the kind of violence that they contribute to. And this sort of investment in showing how good they are often happens through, what they would define charitable humanitarian work, which it's not, because it is completely exclusionary settler colonial nationalist projects that are being seen through. So there's a lot of emphasis again on constructing multiple narratives of how good they are through very, very elaborate systems of what they call community work. And interestingly, these are the systems that they use to then carry out all the surveillance, not only of the communities that they are perpetuating violence against, but also of their own communities. So also surveilling fellow people in the settler colonial project, or fellow people in settlements, fellow people in Hindu nationalist neighborhoods or Hindu neighborhoods, to see who is contributing to the movement and who is not. So also sort of like turning that surveillance inwards to keep policing each other and to continue to perpetuate violence in different forms. The other thing that comes up a lot in these spaces where actively people are coming together to plan violent acts, movements, structures to continue to perpetuate this violence, is that there is a lot of focus on community building, friendship, and love. So a lot of these networks are held together because of narratives of familiarity, of friendship, sociability. There's a lot of emphasis on making sure that every single space in which women in the right-wing movements and in the settler colonial movements are doing this work are spaces of leisure and pleasure and joy. And so there's almost this sort of this very dark narrative of how we deserve joy because we are the victims, and this becomes part of solidifying how violence works. So in my research, I found that often meetings that women would have in order to plan what they called actions or what they call community work, which would involve active violence against Palestinians, against Muslims, against Kashmiris. In these spaces, there's a lot of emphasis on cultivating joy. And it's really eerie as to how it mirrors the discourse that we see and the kind of praxis that we see in, say, feminist queer communities, where we are talking about cultivating community, cultivating joy, and a similar kind of narrative becomes used, but for very exclusionary purposes through exclusionary mechanisms. So I'm thinking here of all this, and I think just to sort of wrap it up, I'm going to show a video, which I was not planning to show. I was just going to talk about it, but I found it on YouTube. It's just a minute long, so I'll just show that. But a couple of things I wanted to say. One, for me, it becomes important to find connections, transnational connections, in how violence is perpetuated, because these systems are so interlocking. And we've seen that recently with the action, for example, by Palestine Action, who shut down Elbit Systems factory in the UK. And one of the things that they were saying that, these are weapons that are used in Palestine, tested in Kashmir. And so that itself shows us, this is just one example. We know that violence exists on a continuum. We know that settler colonial regimes work together. We know that global capital structures a lot of things that we are talking about here. So on one hand, looking at transnational connections of violence, and then on the other hand, of course, looking at transnational connections of solidarity and resistance. The narrative that Ruba has read out would find resonance in narratives coming from Kashmir right now in different ways. And again, we've seen the kind of solidarity work that Kashmiris have been doing with Palestinians. Palestinians have been doing with Black Lives Matter, and the ways in which Colombia, Palestine, BLM, Kashmir, all of these struggles have come together even in just the last few months, and the ways in which people have been quite insistent that we have to fight all of this through a transnational internationalist framework. So I'm going to show you a video, and it's going to look really disconnected from everything we're talking about, but I do have a point as to what I want to say with that. It is an advertisement that came out by a company called Tanishq, which is a company that makes jewelry in India. And it's quite a popular company that makes jewelry. And in India, currently, there's like a Hindu right-wing, Hindu fascist government that has been in power since 2014. This is the second term. And the movement of Hindu right-wing, Hindu nationalism, there are various names that are given to it, has been ongoing for a long time. It emerged in the 1920s, framing itself as an anti-colonial movement, but actually was a right-wing nationalist movement that imagines the land of India, not just India geographically, but also like South Asia broadly, from Kandahar in Afghanistan to Cambodia, really, as land that belongs to Hindus, and any other religion or race, like those distinctions are also quite blurry, who belong to that land. So basically to exclude Muslims and Christians mainly. And it's a very casteist movement that is rooted in like a very caste domination framework that also wants to exclude and perpetuate harms towards Dalit Adivasi communities that are untouchable, what were called untouchable communities and indigenous communities in India. And a lot of the framing of this movement has been around why Muslims are a danger to India. And this framing takes on various, forms. It gets articulated differently. In the pandemic, for example, there was a lot of discussion on how Muslims in India are having gatherings that are religious gatherings, and hence are like spreading the virus. And while this is like, again, like this is not new, we've heard this in the context of the UK when it comes to like BME communities, we've heard this in the context of East Asian communities. And in the context of India, there were news channels that were basically showing pictures or graphics that they had created where the virus was signified as Muslim, and so perpetuating that same idea that there is danger. And so one of the common ways in which this idea gets perpetuated is, of course, through gender and sexuality, because, both Ruba and I are gender studies people, like will tell you everything is about gender and sexuality. And so obviously the Muslim man becomes a threat, as a sexual threat to the sanctity of Hindu women and their bodies, and by extension, the Hindu nation and everything that has to do with upper caste, patriarchal imagination of being Hindu. So I'll show you the ad and I'll talk more. It's 45 seconds long. I'll share my screen. And so this ad came out in October, and it was only 45 seconds long, and then I'll tell you what happened. So let me first put the volume.
रिश्ते हैं कुछ नए नए।
I'll explain later what they're saying.
धागे हैं ये कच्चे पक्के, अपने बन से इन्हें सहलाएंगे, प्यार पिरोते जाएंगे, एक से दूजा सिरा जोड़ लेंगे, एक बंधन बुनते जाएंगे।
ये रस्म तो आपके घर पे होती भी नहीं है ना?
पर बिटिया को खुश रखने की रस्म तो हर घर में होती है ना। एक जो हुए हम तो क्या ना कर जाएंगे। एक अथवा।
Okay, sorry, there were lots of random ads that it was showing that I didn't know how to shut down. So what is happening essentially in this ad, and I know like it can be like hard to understand the cultural signifiers, is that the woman in the ad, the woman who's pregnant and who's, the newlywed sort of, she's signified as quite like newlywed in this family and pregnant, is a Hindu woman. And you can tell that from the way that she's dressed and the way in which, she's sort of conducting herself. And the family that she's married into is a Muslim family, because her mother-in-law again has been signified as a Muslim woman. And in sort of like the South Asian register of like trying to understand, what is happening, if you watch this as someone who is in India or just broadly South Asia, you'd be able to like tell what is really going on in this scene. So basically what we see here is a Hindu woman who's pregnant and she's married into a Muslim family, and her mother-in-law is telling her like, come, let's go to the garden at the back of the house. You can see it's a very luxurious, affluent family as well. And then in the garden at the back, her mother-in-law has organized like a ritual, which is a Hindu ritual and usually does not happen in Muslim families. And it's a ritual for pregnant women, and particularly like upper caste pregnant women, upper caste Hindu pregnant women. And so she says to her mother-in-law that like, but you don't do this in your family. And the mother-in-law says, yeah, but like, this is a merger of like 2 different families and 2 different people. So, you know, we want to keep you happy. Like, we want you to be happy. And her family is there. As you can see, there was someone wearing the hijab, which again, like signifies that like her side of the family is here. Now this ad came out, it was 45 seconds long. And then basically all of the internet and everything exploded because the Hindu right wing in India immediately started talking about how this ad was love jihad, which is a concept that they've come up with in the last few years and have been talking about a lot and also acting on, which is essentially a concept that Hindu women get groomed by Muslim men and then get duped into marrying Muslim men and then eventually get pregnant and have Muslim babies. And by the time they find out that these men are Muslim, because often the idea is that these men fool them into marrying them by pretending to be Hindu. And so like women that I interviewed would say things like, you know, he'll tell you his name is Ram, but his name is actually Rahim. And he will dupe you enough that you can't really get out of it. Like your honor is compromised in some way. You know, so some of the women would tell me that, you know, our girls, Hindu girls, our girls, you know, they'll sit behind on motorbikes, they'll sit behind these guys, and their honor is completely lost once they sort of engage in this kind of romantic sexual behavior with them. And hence they end up marrying into these families and then are forced to have Muslim children. And this is like a plan that Muslim men have. And this is, it may just sound like some kind of like weird discourse, but there's now laws in parts of India which prohibit marriages between Hindus and Muslims until an external authority is consulted to make sure that this is not a case of love jihad. It becomes yet another way really to control women's bodies through this narrative, and to also ensure caste endogamy, where upper caste Hindu women should only marry within upper caste Hindu families to perpetuate the upper caste Hindu nation. And also, like a lot of the women that I engaged with who were part of the Hindu right-wing movement would talk about how they have like counseling centers where they counsel victims of love jihad, as well as also beat up the men who are involved. So sort of this is the understanding. So when the ad came out, there was a lot of drama in India. People began to immediately run a campaign called Boycott Tanishq, which is the jewelry company that put out the ad. And the whole situation got quite bad. There were like, the state was making statements about how this ad is not acceptable because it's perpetuating love jihad. People were talking about how this is not acceptable. And so all of this was going on. Now, interestingly, and this is my point, like a response to this violence, because obviously love jihad is violence. It's caste violence, it's, you know, Islamophobic violence, it's fascist right-wing violence, it's violence against women's bodies, it's gender-based sexualized violence, really, this narrative of love jihad that the Hindu right wing is perpetuating. But one of the main responses to this violence was that a lot of liberal Indians started to talk about the glorious old times when India was such a great country. You know, we were secular, we were multicultural, we didn't have all of these things. And they started to run a campaign called Save Tanishq, and how we must like save this brand and buy things from this brand. And this is the point that I'm going to make, is basically that this narrative of love to counter violence often itself becomes violence. Because in this narrative of love, nostalgia for this past India was continuously invoked as a way to fight the right wing. But that past India was also run along regimes of caste mainly, but also class, also Islamophobia, also gender. In this past India as well, love was being defined through caste lines, where violence against intercaste marriages was something and is something that was very, very, very much happening and continues to happen, and supported by the state and supported by society. So in this sort of response to violence, by framing love in a particular way, we erase the violence of liberal secularism, really. We erase the violence of caste structures. We erase the violence of many other ways in which gender, sexuality, caste, and class were being invoked. Secondly, the group Tanishq, the jewelry group, is owned by a company called the Tata Group. And the Tata Group are some of the biggest corporate owners in India. And interestingly, they are big donors to the Hindu right-wing party. And so again, and of course, they are very much responsible for privatization of natural resources, for dispossession, for ongoing struggles that are happening with indigenous communities and other communities in India. So what is happening here is, in this sort of like run to use love as a framework against violence, especially this kind of love and this kind of liberal articulation of love, we erase many other forms of violence that are ongoing and that have structured India long before the Hindu right wing came to power. And I think the bigger point here is that this often happens. And in my work, when I was doing my PhD, I also made these mistakes where I focused so much on settlers in the West Bank that, and the sort of framing of the right wing, that you then kind of lose or erase or obfuscate the ongoing liberal violence that happens, beyond that. Like in the context of India, where caste regimes have always been violent and continue to be violent, or like in the context of Palestine, where the problem is not just the settlers in the West Bank, but the entire existence of the settler colonial state. So sort of I'll end there, but just to make that point, that how we think about violence and respond to violence, even in our organizing or our affective, emotional responses, is also sometimes very violent and very much an erasure.
Thank you so much, both of you, for speaking. I'm just sort of conscious of the time and want to give people some space to ask any questions. Yeah, there's some nice hand claps from people listening, which is really nice to see. I thought I have some questions I can ask, but I thought I'd just give space now. If anyone who was in the audience wanted to put a question in the chat or unmute themselves to speak, I can see Amelia's put in the chat, I can, which I believe might be a question. So Amelia, if you want to go ahead and ask, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you so much. That was all incredibly fascinating and firing. And I was just thinking about the kind of like day-to-day nature of violence, and so the potentiality of work through trauma and what can be found through that, and particularly as Reba was saying, Palestinian women's agentic voices. But then I was also considering how so much of a particularly Western framing around Palestinian existence is only based through extreme violence and trauma. So we then kind of, how do we make sure that we also still stay engaged with the daily violence that is happening to Palestinians, or the daily violence that is happening in Kashmir? Because, when we think about the last few weeks, how suddenly it's almost like you could think from looking at Twitter or the news, everything's sorted, but everything's fine for Palestine, apart from through a few channels. So how do we allow for more a kind of myriad voices and agency and working through trauma and violence, and also not push for this kind of a white savior NGO response that reacts to the big things or the most extreme things, or the times when international media will put lots of children's faces on newspapers. But how do we stay engaged with the daily violence? And I know that's probably not a short answer, but that was just my thought after all the brilliant stuff you said. Yeah.
Do you want me to respond, or yeah? Thank you very much for this brilliant question, which really not only goes to the core of the issue, but also I think allows to see also the continuities between what Akanshka and I were talking about, despite obviously the different narratives we shared. I wanted to take this opportunity to actually reiterate something that Akanshka said at the end, and I really also think that my attempt was to show how in the attempt to counter violence, we might reproduce a certain type of violence. And differently from Akanshka, in my talk, I wanted to emphasize how the forceful and the need to remember in a certain frame and framework, coupled with the need to show and to make visible and public and political the grief and the suffering and the pain, which is not to be equated with the nature of trauma. This is in itself a traumatic experience, I think. So the need to do all of this in a way brings more violence. I mean, it's a violent act in itself. Because I believe that when you are obliged for the erasure you need to confront, the daily erasure in mainstream media, in mainstream narratives and so on, you are obliged to ask a child, how do you feel after your house has been shelled and you lost everyone? This is not the trauma I'm talking about. I think this is traumatic in itself and is a form of dehumanization that we as, I mean, obviously I am a much more privileged kind of Palestinian in the diaspora, but we as Palestinians have to endure. The second point that I wanted to make is that when I talk to a lot of women whose narrative appear as not verifiable, so to speak, according to our mainstream understanding of what do we have to say to make ourselves be seen and believed according to sort of the canons of historical validity that we don't set ourselves, that are set by the context in which we are, which is highly asymmetrical as well. So when we are asked to marginalize memories that cannot be articulated, that cannot be narrated through a fact-based narrative, that cannot be articulated as clear and cogent and cognitive, because they are about traumas that women and sorry, this is my 7-year-old child. So when we are asked to fit into these canons for us to be believed, we are also being violated. And this is, I think, where I think Primo Levi is very useful, because Primo Levi, in his wonderful work, painful to read and to deal with, obviously, has taught us what it means to think through memory via the lens and the frame of trauma. Trauma doesn't allow you to process and to speak in an articulate way, in a cognitive way, and often these memories that are denied existence and validity because they are not fact verifiable, let's say, but they are they are narrated as flashbacks, they are narrated as feelings, memories of violent horror moments, but also of very ordinary, insignificant events or facts that have not got much visibility also in the nationalist tradition. These are symptoms of the trauma that people have endured, and that's, and it is often the body that keeps the score of this kind of violence that cannot be accorded validity because it cannot be articulated in the way that I explained. So to come back to your question about the ordinary and the everyday, I think, for example, in my work, at least, I try to make an effort to think about the violence of dispossessing people from their home as opposed to dispossessing people from their homeland. What it means to lose your own home restores to us an understanding of what's at stake in a settler colonial project. It is not just a question of land and dispossession in a material sense. It is a dispossession of relations, of memories, of safety, of gender relations, of normality, of pain and laughter and grief and everything that Akanshka started her talk with this early today. So I think the lens of home, the everydayness of the violence of losing one's home as opposed to just losing one's homeland, I think is really a way to go for. And I think that what we began to see this or to grasp the enormity of losing one's home in Sheikh Jarrah. I mean, at least we have had exposure to the everydayness of these forms of expropriation, which are paradoxically also forms of coexistence, because in Sheikh Jarrah, the two the two young man and woman who became quite prominent in this resistance in Sheikh Jarrah are Muna and Muhammad al-Kurd, who have lived for years. Their home has been taken by the settlers, and they live in the same home, like in two parts of the same home. So again, I think there is a lot to gain by applying this lens. And finally, really my last word is about something that I always like to mention. So in the memories of the ghetto, of the Warsaw Ghetto, there is a memoir that has been written by a socialist, Bundist, Jewish fighter, which is titled The Ghetto Wars. And he recalls how Eric Edelman was his name. He recalls how the fight that was going on in the ghetto, the resistance in the ghetto, wasn't a resistance to create a homeland somewhere else at the expense of another people, but it was a fight for home. And so I think that this trope of home goes way back, and it's a useful kind of lens to rethink history and what went on in this long-term conflict. Thank you.
I really like what you said, Ruba, about shifting the conversation and the struggle from like homeland to home and all that holds together. Like the way you described it right now was really quite like it's really moving and also really useful in terms of organizing and thinking about how to organize. Because it also then counters the narrative of the nation, right? Like, which we know that we are also struggling with. And this came up in anti-colonial struggles so much, that what is anti-colonial about the anti-colonial struggle if the end is to achieve a nation state of a particular kind. So I think like if we shift to like what you described home as, and also what you just described home as, all of those things, relations, relationalities, memories, archives, histories, all put together. Thanks for that. Like that was really moving.
No, thank you also for your brilliant, if I may, for your brilliant talk, which was so enlightening and really interesting. And I so much would like to know more. I haven't seen, sorry for this, but I haven't seen Akanshka, although I follow her work, but I haven't seen her for a while. So I need to use this opportunity to also convey to her my admiration for her work.
Yeah, we haven't seen each other since I finished the PhD, I think almost, 4 years ago,
Exactly.
We're so grateful to both of you for speaking here tonight. I can't really emphasize that enough. I just wanted to check in case anyone else in the audience had any pressing or non-pressing questions they wanted to ask just before we wrap up, just because I'm conscious of the time. So do interject if you would like to ask something, and it's also fine if not. Cool. I think it seems like there aren't any more questions. I mean, I have so many things I could ask. I also am aware that it's 7:15 and people probably want to go and have dinner. I guess I'm just thinking if I might briefly ask something about, I kind of am really touched, or I'm very interested in the way we think about trauma as inherited or intergenerational forms of violence that might not necessarily explicitly target or be experienced by the children in this relationship, but are still very like felt and present. Is this something I guess is articulated by writers like Grace Cho, or so I wondered if you both might even just briefly speak about how these stories of intergenerational trauma are kind of told and taught and shared, and whether there is a kind of where kind of hope can be found in those spaces, or if there is, or if what might be kind of used in those stories that are told, I guess.
Do you want me to respond?
Yeah, why don't you start?
Well, it's a very complex question. I think that, I mean, at the moment, I'm not very hopeful, I have to say. I mean, if we have to end on a positive note, at least for me, the positive note here is that I was very taken aback and very mesmerized by the creativity, the resilience, and I'm using resilience here not in the kind of UNDP kind of sense of enduring your suffering and be happy with it, but the resilience as in not being defeated, that these young generations who have only seen the occupation throughout their life and have seen only immobility and stuckedness and violence, how creative and how non-violent themselves, non-violent are their forms of resistance and their forms of articulating their predicament, and through poetry, through music, through all kinds of kind of creative forms of visual arts, but also just the creativity of survival, let's say. I was so impressed this time to see all of this going on in the West Bank and in Gaza. And so that's the kind of hopeful note I wanted to end with.
Yeah, I think I agree. And as I said, like earlier, like the transnational connection of like how people have come together, like even just this action happening in the UK by Palestine Action to stop the arms factory. And just the other day when, you know, there were discussions on how the Grenfell Tower fire cladding has a connection to the weapons that are being used in Gaza, and the ways in which that direct action could, like, you know, on the anniversary of Grenfell was really powerful, because we've had absolutely no justice, the people who lost their lives and families and friends and homes. And so I think just making these sorts of connections, which is a place of hope, and like that can be intergenerational work, because it is intergenerational work since the violence has been intergenerational and has been going on for so long. So I think that is where I would look for some kind of hope. And just to see, you know, the man who painted in Kashmir, he climbed up on a bridge and he painted like, "We are Palestine," and then he was arrested by the Indian state for this action that he took of painting this in Kashmir. But just these sorts of acts that always seem to get squashed by the state and by, you know, by the oppressors, but still keep happening. So I think, yeah, that would be where I would see hope of how these intergenerational stories can become something. They already are something, but can become something in a different way as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answers. That's really, really wonderful. I think if we sort of wrap up there, so I guess I'll just finish off by once again thanking the speakers for your amazing contributions, and thanking the audience for being here, and Amy for your help, and I guess just extending, making known this solidarity, this transnational solidarity present here tonight with Palestinians, with all colonized people over the world. So thank you so much, everyone, for being part of this discussion. And I hope that we'll see some of you again in 2 weeks' time for the next session in this series, where we're going to be talking about radical education and supplementary schools. We've got Gurminder Andrews to come and speak about Black supplementary schools, which is going to be a really amazing speech, and Ken Warpole as well to speak about publishing. Thank you so much, everyone, again, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rory, Amy, Ruba. See you soon, Ruba.
See you soon.
Let's have a plan. Yeah. Bye. Thanks, everyone.